Welcome to Strange Coordinates, the show where we use brands as roadmaps to arrive at surprising places. I'm Topher Burns.
And I'm Robert Balog. Topher and I founded an ad agency called Territorial, where what we do is we help brands find their place in the world. And the way we do that is we look at how things like history and culture, what's happening now, what's happened in the past, where consumers are, and what their desires are, all layer on top of each other and collide to reveal insights about what's cool about being human.
On this show, one of us gives the other a brand. That person has to trek off into the wilderness and come back with the story they find most compelling. It's basically using brands as compass points to discover more about the world around us.
Well, so Topher, today it was my job to give you the task of going out and researching a world-famous brand. And the brand that I chose for you was Boeing.
Mm-hmm.
So, first impressions, what did you feel? What was going on inside of your brain when that hit?
Well, you know what? I actually started thinking I really want to know what my dad thinks about this. My dad, retired pilot in the Air Force, also retired engineer. So he was sort of software engineer in the world of national defense for quite some time. So he didn't design planes, but I think he gets the sort of workplace culture,
Sure.
the overall approach, as well as kind of understanding sort of the world of aeronautics very, very well. So I have a few notes from retired pilot, retired engineer that I thought would be a great place to start, actually.
Okay.
Just to kind of level set.
Yeah.
So, we were talking about Boeing and we all know a lot of the basics of the news. And whether you know the specifics, I think everybody knows things aren't going so well for them, right? Things aren't great. That said, my really basic question to him, and I'll pose the same to you, Robert, is just would you fly in a Boeing?
I'm generally an Airbus first kind of person. I don't know why. I think I would, even before all this stuff, I've always kind of have been. Because there was before the doors came off, there was a spate of 737 issues, and those are the workhorses of a lot of the domestic paths, and it just never made me feel comfortable. So, but I know, as a person who understands that there are statistical improbabilities in flying in general when it comes to accidents, I would be foolish to be I'm not going to fly a Boeing. Just the number of accidents versus the number of flights is absurdly tiny.
Yeah. So do you ever, when you say you're an Airbus person, you just mean you're kind of that seems cooler?
No,
and it's not you don't select your flights based on I want to be on an Airbus?
Well, I partially select my airline on that. Delta uses mostly Airbus, at least for the legs that I fly on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a little bit.
Okay. That's it. I think that's interesting. My dad's response was look, it's safer than getting behind the wheel of a car.
Always.
Which is totally true, and all about almost everything in life that we fear. It's you drive. So fair. My dad also has a pilot perspective, and so he's there's a lot of experienced pilots behind the wheel.
Sure.
They're going to make sure you get to where you need to go, and that's fair. But then he did follow that up by saying well, listen, I wouldn't take the Starliner to space. And that really highlighted for me something, he's things just seem like they're going in the wrong direction. And for a company that has this really long heritage history of safety and engineering, consistency, for the latest news, if you Google News search Boeing right now, you're going to find that they've just stranded 2 American pilots in space for another 6 months because they created the Boeing Starliner, and that can't be trusted by NASA to bring their astronauts home from the International Space Station. So he kind of underscores this thing that's just it's hard for me to focus on brand when the company is kind of so busy trashing their own brand right now.
Right.
What this really made me think is that this is a cool opportunity to actually dial in on like, what is a brand supposed to do?
Right.
And how does it work? Just at a super functional level. And we may have cracked the door open a little bit to this thinking on our last episode, where you started poking some existential questions into our discussion of MGM to be like, what's really a brand? I'm going to take it from, that was like an existential level. I'm going to go be like, what does a brand do functionally?
Yeah.
Because I actually think that Boeing is sort of at that place where they really need to ask themselves, what's their brand doing for them? What are they doing for their brand? There's a lot of work to be done here. So it feels like a really nice moment in the life of this brand to be able to kind of like interrogate those fundamentals.
Yeah. I think you're doing a thing by proceeding this way that my family has asked for me for as long as I've had this career, which is like, really, what is it you do? What is it you spend your time doing?
Right. And the problem is every time we describe that, we tell people, they just don't remember.
Right.
Which is fundamentally a failure of branding, right?
Fair.
So I don't know that I'm going to like help us overcome that and carry the entire industry.
Yeah.
But I think at least we can sort of underscore some of the basic like fundamentals of the thing.
Yeah. All right. I'm excited for this. This is amazing.
All right. So we're going to do it in 3 little pieces.
Okay, cool.
3 parts.
3 parts.
First, logo.
Yes.
So most people think of a logo when you think of a brand. And the two things are very well entwined, as you and I know. But obviously not. The logo isn't the entirety of the brand. But it's a great place to start.
Yeah.
And the reason I want to start with the logo for Boeing is it actually, really fascinatingly, their current logo today tells the story of the entire company.
Oh, amazing.
It is all baked into that.
Cool.
So the very first logo of Boeing that you can't see in its current iteration now at all, but is fascinating, was what they called the totem. And it was Boeing stacked vertically, and it has little wings coming out the top around the B and the O. And what that signified was not just air travel, but also the fact that it was a company born in the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
So born in Seattle, and they kind of celebrated the Seattle roots with that logo. The logo did not last, but as the company grew, they decided to get real about getting a logo around 1945. And what they did is they created what you still see as what we'd refer to as like the word mark, the actual writing of the letters Boeing. And engineers came up with that. So it wasn't like they brought in like a celebrated designer or anything like that. Just the engineers in their office, sort of like some guys were draftsmen, and they came up with this. They call it stratotype.
Ooh.
So
Does it have its own typeface?
I don't know if it has its own full typeface, but they talk about it as being done in stratotype. They do not use stratotype, as far as I could tell, in any other places in how they communicate. But some people might not know, but most companies, especially heritage companies, kind of when they have their own hand-done lettering and stuff like that, they tend to give it a name. And that's why I think it's kind of cool that engineers are the ones that created the word mark. It's very distinctive in terms of it has a lot of velocity to it. It's a hard lean. So that piece was invented in 1945, and that served as the brand for a really long time. Then Boeing went through a series of acquisitions and mergers and stuff like that. It's reminiscent of the MGM conversation we had yesterday or last episode, where there's a lot of like things come in, things go out, etc. Anyway, they got through that, but they felt like they needed to grow. So what they started doing is buying up a bunch of other like engineering-focused aeronautical companies, and that's what led them to purchase McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas was not doing so well, but they had done a lot of like designing of a variety of different things, and those products are what created the McDonnell Douglas logo. It said McDonnell Douglas in some lettering, and then there's a few different shapes around it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a circle.
Yeah.
There's a like sort of curvy thing.
Right.
And then there's like a little bit of like a triangle delta thing.
Uh-huh.
Those, in and of themselves, have their own heritage. McDonnell Douglas didn't used to be together. There used to be McDonnell and Douglas. So first there was Douglas. And Douglas, the people who, they made planes early on, and they were the first company to make planes that circumnavigated the globe.
Oh, hence the circle.
So their logo was the circle with a little spinny thing around it, being like, we're the ones that made it around this.
Right.
When Douglas merged with McDonnell to make McDonnell Douglas, and then they went into the more tactically aggressive world of aeronautics, meaning making missiles.
Yeah.
They wanted to show, like, hey, not only do we make planes, the little delta, but we also make missiles. So the curvy thing that used to be we circumnavigate the globe became the trajectory of the missile that is being fired.
Nice.
So you have this shape of this circle, curve, and then the delta. The curve had a missile on it, but then when Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, they took the Douglas, they took the McDonnell part of it, and then so they simplified all those shapes. So you have the circle, the swoop, and the little delta, and they just put it on the end of Boeing because now Boeing does all those things.
Right.
So it kind of is this like Frankenstein of a Frankenstein.
Right.
It shows like all these component little pieces that go into creating what is now, believe it or not, the United States' largest exporter by dollar value.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Are they still the parent company of McDonnell Douglas?
They just subsumed them. So yeah, like the McDonnell Douglas stuff sits under the larger Boeing corporate structure. Yeah.
Because that means they supply militaries, they supply domestic, and they supply foreign airlines. Yeah, there's a lot there. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in this one little logo, if you start to pick it apart, you start to discover a 100+ year history of the company, all kind of like bound up in these little symbols and design choices. So I think it's kind of fascinating to see how that stuff still kind of like communicates with itself.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so logo.
Yeah.
That's first piece. Piece number 2, target market.
Oh.
So something that you brought up on our previous episode was you said, we haven't really talked about B2B brands.
Yeah.
And that is true. We haven't. So I'm glad we're doing this. But I think this brand serves as a little bit of an exception. Because what I think is fascinating, the more I thought about it and the more I dug into it, is that over the past 10, but really like past couple years, Boeing, whether it likes it or not, has become a B2C brand.
Mm-hmm.
And you
is that why
proved it.
You asked me that question at the top of the conversation?
Yeah, you proved it a little bit.
Little bear trap we laid there. A little bit of a bear trap.
I put out bait, and I see if you come and stick your nose in it. The thing that happened is because of the crisis that Boeing went through with all the safety challenges that they've been having, all those things, they have become a brand that consumers actually have to care about. So in a world where there's B2B and B2C, and for those of you for whom we should unpack our lame jargon a little bit more, B2B just being business to business, B2C being business to consumer, most business to business companies aren't thought of as necessarily investing as much in their brand because traditionally the thinking goes that the reason businesses decide to buy from other businesses is all dollars and cents. And it's all about, like the rational. And so it doesn't matter what you call a thing. If it's the best product, people will buy it. And to some degree that's true, but this space is maturing and there are a lot of reasons to think about B2B as being something that still needs to be able to communicate values and et cetera. Mm-hmm. B2B doesn't really like living in a B2C world if they want to be able to communicate on things like I was saying, like dollar, like the numbers,
Right.
The supply chain, whatever those things might be.
Yeah.
But, people have to care if they're like, wait, do these planes serve like a danger to me? Like, should I be getting in a plane? Gosh, 300 plus people have died on a Boeing in recent memory, and
Right.
far more people have been terrified by being on planes where things haven't gone well. And 2 astronauts up in space are right now cursing the fact that they chose to
Right.
take a trip up there in a Boeing. So, like, should I?
Right.
So we're kind of in this world where, like, suddenly a company that is not adept at communicating with consumers is having to do so.
Yeah, it's really unique because you're not. I'm not a consumer of airplanes. I'm not going out and buying an airplane from Boeing, but I am living in relationship to that brand in a very, very immediate way that is different than when I buy a pair of shoes.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's the same. Well, we also haven't talked about the fact that the B2B to B2C, B2B and B2C's divide is in many ways often confusing because every business is filled with people. So if you're selling from one business to another business, you're selling to a human. And then there's the B2B to C, which is kind of like sort of what Boeing is the intermediated industries where there's a person in the middle who sells you something that the business sold to them.
Yes. And that's that actually, because I started digging into this more, like brands that, have to switch really quickly from being B2B and figuring out how to speak to consumers. It's a really difficult pivot that needs to be made. And it's always a crisis that pushes them forward into that. A lot of times food safety issues can trigger this. So when there's like a, have you ever gotten a text from your mom saying, like, did you buy anything from Trader Joe's in the past year that had broccoli in it? It's like stuff like that they're like, wait, this one factory that processes broccoli had a listeria outbreak, and you need to be really, and so those are the times when we as consumers actually have to do our own research and dig into the guts of this like very messy commercial system that brands usually paper over, and we just get the B2C side. But then we have to like dig into them and learn about the B2B stuff in order to protect ourselves and not die screaming, plummeting from the sky, or, sick from listeria.
That got dark.
I mean, I'm actually, we will get to that very dark moment later too.
Wow, jeez.
But just to put forward, I was challenged myself. Like, okay, is it always crises? Crises? Is it always crisscross applesauce that forces brands to move from B2B to B2C? There are a few exceptions where there's kind of like that branching from a world of like communicating within an industry to communicating to your end consumer. One that I thought of that is still obviously a crisis, but is maybe less, the choice is less bad for the brands themselves. Do you remember the like whole like world of signaling by which vaccine you got during COVID?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Moderna.
So there was like, are you a Moderna person? Are you a Pfizer person? Are you a Johnson & Johnson person? What did you go?
I was Moderna. We were Moderna all the way, the whole time. And I think it started accidentally. Yeah. And then we just leaned into it. We got our boosters and all that stuff, yeah.
You're like, I want to coordinate.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I maybe, just to be a contrarian, went Pfizer.
Yeah.
But like no one went Johnson & Johnson, right? Like there wasn't anybody out there being like repping the Johnson & Johnson.
No, it was hard. Like because there was the one benefit was I think it was a one shot, right? But the drawback was there were like side effects.
And the things like less protection, like I think because they did the egg method or you know what I mean? Like I forget exactly what it was.
Yeah.
Another one that's even more pleasant and less troubling is in the world of tech. NVIDIA is a really fascinating brand because just in the same way that like you, Robert, as a person who flies, don't buy planes, you also, as maybe a person who consumes AI services or a person who maybe games from time to time, I'm not sure. You don't buy a microchip, but you use things that have them.
Sure.
NVIDIA has sort of found itself in the very enviable position of sort of being seated at the center of very trendy and hot industries when it comes to things like gaming and AI. And so knowing that your game console has NVIDIA, that your AI services are powered with NVIDIA, those types of things do communicate something to a more educated market about, how high quality your services are. I mean, I think it's the interesting thing about where this nets out is that whether they liked it or not, Boeing was facing down a world where on Kayak you could search travel and filter out any legs of travel that had Boeing. Mm-hmm. So you could just be like, I'm not going to get on a Boeing plane.
That's so harsh.
And so, once that feature's on there, suddenly you are in a really, like in that moment, it's not like Boeing makes less money from that transaction, but every airline that's getting filtered out of that consumer choice moment is pissed that Boeing has made them miss out on that. Uh-huh. So that's where it ends up affecting their bottom line.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay.
So we've talked about logo. We've talked about target market. Mm-hmm. I want to go into another, for our third point, I want to go into another component here of basic brand stuff called brand strategy. Now, brand strategy. Yeah, and not to toot my own horn as kind of the more strategery component of our partnership, but what I think is interesting is that for folks who aren't in the world of conversations where you're talking with somebody about selling them some advertising services, some brand services, strategy often gets kind of put into basically the chopping block of the negotiations. And totally get it, and there's lots of times where we slim down what we're doing on a strategy side. But I think this is a good moment to kind of touch base on how important brand strategy actually can be. Mm-hmm. Because the more I dug into brand strategy for Boeing, the more I felt like it showed us the rest of the picture. So if the logo is giving us the history, and the B2B/B2C is sort of giving the setting of the audience that they need to communicate with, the brand strategy of Boeing really fleshes out the rest of the picture that tells you what's going on in their world. And I actually found some really great documents that unpack some of the Boeing brand strategy, and I'm gonna cherry pick some pieces from there that really highlight just oh wow, either I know why they're doing what they're doing now, or they say they want to do this, but it's clear that they really don't care about it at all.
Right.
So at its highest, if I had to just be what is the point of brand strategy? It's the DNA of the brand, right? It's just codifying what it is that you are. It gives you the instructions for how to behave, how to look, how to act. It's the difference between genotype and phenotype, right? Genotype is your genes look this way. Phenotype is you as an organism are expressed this way. And the reason you're expressed this way is as much environmental as genetic. But it's kind of so the genotype is the DNA of the brand, and the phenotype is what the brand that you encounter in the wild.
Right.
And I realized that I started actually in a more understandable place, and then brought us to Bio 202.
You brought us right to a whole. We've talked about industrial policy, We've talked about militarization. We've now gone into biology. This is jam-packed, Topher.
Yeah, and I didn't make the thing more easy to understand. So
It's okay. We
retract
respect our
it.
listener. We respect our listener.
Yeah.
They can follow
Yeah.
us on this journey.
Yeah, they know what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the document, a brand strategy document, is just going to have all the like little pieces, like who are we, what do we say, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of different ways to describe those things and systems, and everybody's got their own little structure. And you and I talk about that a lot. How
Yeah,
it's like
totally.
you can put it in different shapes, you can use different words for it, but at the end of the day,
you can put it into like
you
things
can
that-
stack it, you can take, yeah.
What is that from? Oh my god!
I don't know. I could like,
Yeah.
I feel like there's the beginning of a song.
That's
in
that's
there.
a '90s toy of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, stack it, bop it, twist it. Yeah. Yeah. It's the Simon Says thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So we can do that with our brand strategy
Perfect.
pyramids in the future.
Yeah.
Whether it's a keyhole or a heart or a triangle, you got to have that. If it doesn't enable you to know who you are and how to act in
Right.
a given scenario, then it's not good strategy. And if it helps you do that, then put it in whatever shape you want. Let your freak flag fly.
Yeah.
So, when I dug into the Boeing strategy, they have this component. It's like brand values on their website. They weirdly, related to this sort of like bop it, twist it, stack it thing.
Yeah.
They break out their brand values into two things that to me sound exactly the same.
Okay.
One chunk is how we operate, and the other chunk is how we act.
Huh.
I couldn't intuit from reading the list
Okay.
of those things how they were different from each other. They felt like two clusters of things that maybe at one point were really important to keep separate, and at this point they just are kind of vestigially divided from each other for reasons that didn't really make
Maybe
sense.
there really should be no air between how you operate and how you act. Like maybe that might be some of the problem here.
Yeah, maybe so.
Like,
I would
yeah.
yeah, it could be a beginning of a problem. So the very first thing in the list, once they explain like, here's our values and this is how we operate, then the first thing is lead on safety.
All right. Okay.
Well.
Let's just maybe move on to the second one because that's too wide open. That's an easy target.
Yes. I thought that one was self-evident too. I was like, all right, well, next. They have a line that says crush bureaucracy.
Okay.
And I think that is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because what my dad mentioned as sort of like his first off the top impression of Boeing is super, super relevant. When Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, McDonnell Douglas wasn't doing that great on the engineering side, but they were doing really well in terms of like the financial instruments and applications they were creating to the company. So when the two companies merged, it kind of created this battle royale where the engineering culture was fighting kind of like the finance culture.
Right.
And so you had like financial engineers versus like aerospace engineers. But like you can imagine in a corporate setting which camp won.
Right. Yeah. The financial.
So, yeah.
Of course.
So you have all these like Wall Street sharks who eventually end up getting a hold of this massive, massive company that is spanned into defense contracting, commercial aeronautics, all of these things. And then their extant supply chains with creating all of those things, like an enormous thing. So these Wall Street guys have a hold of this huge amount of capital and power to push around, such that like even if you read European articles, which I did do because I just disappeared down this hole about like
how deep we go for you, listener. European articles, ladies and gentlemen. Can you imagine?
of all things.
Of all things, European articles.
But their perception in Europe, and this could be colored a little bit by, the fact that Airbus is based in Europe. But the perception in Europe is that Boeing is not only too big to fail at the U.S. level, but it's potentially too big to fail as a company at the global level. It just can't fail because actually it is globally significant.
Right.
So in that space, I think the phrase crush bureaucracy is a really interesting one that would be very valuable to me if I am a Wall Street executive who is really interested in speeding times of delivery,
Right.
finding efficiencies. I might look at things that are,
Right.
duplicates in a supply chain that are there just to create redundancies and say, our things are plenty safe enough. We have a culture of safety. You can see it. It's number one.
It's the
Let's
number one
lead on
thing.
safety.
Yeah.
So, done. Please make this faster.
Right.
Let's break off our component pieces. Let's create incentives that aren't exactly all about safety at every level of the supply chain. So, I looked at crush bureaucracy in their little corporate values, and I thought, I feel like that was used to fire a lot of aerospace engineers.
And if you think about how an aerospace engineer would look at that, and how they would approach a value like that, which would be, those structures that get in the way of making a thing more safe, perform better, more sound structurally, those things that are there to increase, to slow things down.
Reliability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's super interesting.
Next topic, they talk about creating a just culture.
Okay.
And they capitalize it. Capital J, capital C, just culture. And they use that in a sentence that is about basically whistleblowers, which is a very sensitive subject for Boeing. That led, one of the things that put Boeing in the news was basically the Boeing version of Epstein didn't kill himself, which is the whistleblower. As a just a consumer of news, when I heard that this whistleblower who was just about to be deposed was found dead by gunshot in a parking lot, I mean, I was definitely like, they might not have wanted him to talk. The interesting thing about all of that is the more I dug into it, he was not one standing against. He was not a Silkwood figure.
Right.
One of hundreds. He was one of hundreds of whistleblowers against Boeing. And so does that mean that Boeing didn't have a role to play even if he did actually commit suicide in terms of the amount of pressure that they put on him, his family, his future? I can't imagine that this entire system that people have described as too big to fail was gonna go down easy or be really especially kind to him in a lawsuit. At the same time, it contextualized once it seemed like it was oh yeah, well, if you've got hundreds of whistleblowers, are a few of them gonna die, even just natural causes? Yeah. So it kind of contextualized the whistleblowing thing as a line item to me.
Right.
But I just thought it was really interesting that Boeing wanted to kind of mention their just culture, and the fact that they capitalized it makes me think that there's a whole internal sort of whatever.
Yeah. That's interesting that, and I'm sure there are more of these?
Yeah, we got a few more.
Okay. Well, what I'm thinking of as we're going through this is that it's often in B2B companies where internal values get externalized to the audience. I don't oftentimes think about what the internal values are of, let's say, Nike, only when all of a sudden there's a crisis in terms of their supply chain,
Sweatshop stuff.
Sweatshops. But
yeah,
on a day-to-day basis as a consumer, I'm not really exposed, nor am I looking for how are those employees going about their business inside of Nike? But it is very, very common in B2B companies to actually externalize, how are we doing what we do inside of our organization? And that becomes a very meaningful thing for buyers.
Yes. That's an interesting segue to this next one
cool.
that I want to talk about, actually, because that's a great point that like the B2B companies don't do the work of sort of translating external values to customers because they just kind of are like the things we do are basically what you're buying.
Right.
They name check diversity specifically. And the reason that's interesting is because when a lot of the terrible headlines were peaking about the doors blowing off
Right.
and stuff like that, something that like there's a lot of people use the Boeing crisis as a lot of like case studies.
Yeah.
So you can go into like PR software and they'll be like using Boeing as a case study to talk about like your crisis and what maps it. And one of the things that put through a peak on a peak in terms of like negative news and like made things worse was when Elon Musk blamed DEI initiatives for why Boeing was
bullshit.
doing so poorly. Yeah. So this was maybe the moment where I was like, okay, good for you, boy. Like, I'm very pleased that in a world where there's a lot of flight from and fear of claiming things like diversity specifically, I am glad that that's still on there.
Right. Because they could have easily scrubbed it. And
people have alighted that in a lot of different ways, like used different terms or like encapsulated diversity in something like larger about the types of like workforce that you work with and stuff like that. Yeah. On their list, they do say, and they say lead on and safety is the first one and then sustainability is the last one. So they're doing about as good on the first S as they are on the second. 11% of the entire emissions that the Earth sort of exudes into the atmosphere come from air travel. So it's kind of like, when BP is like, we're leading on sustainability. And it's like, well, I just don't think you've thought about that at all or are being at all honest with yourself.
Well, it's also the fact, like, you have to lead because you do make the biggest impact. So, like,
right, you literally are leading.
Anything you do will make so much more of an impact than anything an individual does because you have so much of an oversized impact on the environment in general.
Yeah. They have a line that says, earn stakeholder trust and preference, which is a very corporate way to talk about like you've got a lot of work to do to like start people getting back on your side, especially like your airline company clients to buy your stuff. There is nothing remotely human or emotive about this Boeing set of values.
Right.
So they say safety, but really the way that they describe it even is just like, it's not about the value of human life or freedom from fear.
Right.
It's about not making a mistake.
Right.
It is a mechanical like expression of how they create a thing. And nowhere does that live more into how you can see how Boeing truly feels and operates than in a court fight that they had in Illinois about the Ethiopia flight. 314 people died on that flight. And they were in sort of negotiations about how to remunerate the families and loved ones of the people who died. And that ended up in court in Illinois. And Boeing ended up taking a position that they should not have to pay a pain and suffering addendum to the sort of casualties and to the fees they were paying out because at hypersonic speeds, it is not provable that humans experience pain and suffering.
Oof. This is going to haunt me. You realize that. I'm not going to be able to get this out of my head next time I fly. And I'm going to blame you. I'll be cursing you, Topher. Why did we ever do this podcast, I will say.
You came up with it.
Okay. So that's an interesting I mean, it's both kind of like soothing, but at the same time grotesque.
I think what I think is so fascinating about this is because they don't have a culture that in any way brought them to say, maybe we shouldn't go stand in court and put forward the argument that people plummeting to their deaths on one of our aircraft didn't experience pain and suffering.
Right.
Because that is the most callous, horrible way to treat and speak about the deaths of human beings.
Yeah.
It's I think there's like you can see them say like, well, scientifically speaking and legally speaking, there's definitely an argument here to be made that we could save the amount of millions that we would pay out in damages because, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But nowhere in their values is there anything that they even thought to include in their, like, why we exist and what we believe that would lead them to ask anybody in leadership or give credence to anybody in the company that would say, this is the position we want to take. We want to stand up in a court of law, swear on a Bible, and say that these people who we killed did not experience pain and suffering.
Right.
That's wild to me.
Yeah. I will say that I am strangely feeling less vile about this than you are. And I think yeah, slightly. And I think it's because
take me there.
Well, one is that I just assume it was kind of a legal idea put forth by lawyers and not necessarily by the company. But I also could see a world in which if your roots are in aeronautics and your roots are in, sending test pilots at ridiculous speeds, and if you have that heritage, that sense of like approaching danger and death from a very kind of like statistical scientific perspective seems it could be ingrained in the culture. Like it feels very NASA to me. Like, yes, you're going to be the first person strapped to the essentially like the front of an ICBM. We have no idea what's going to happen, but science suggests that at those speeds, even if it goes wrong, you're probably not going to feel anything. So I can kind of understand where that comes from, like, and also I feel like I spend way too much time thinking about what I would do in those minute and a half from 36,000 feet to 0 feet. And if there's a world in which I might not experience any pain, then I'm feeling like that's the kind of news that I can sit with for a while. That sounds okay.
Okay. So you don't want to hear the counter argument from the plaintiffs on this one, though.
Okay, I do want to hear the counter argument, unless it involves like phone messages and stuff like that. Does it involve?
It's not that personal, but it's basically like
go to hell, eat shit. What? Like two words. Fuck you,
you monsters. Yeah. It's basically a shame on you where they're just like, there's, what that presumes is that you go from normal operation of plane to plummeting really, 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 really fast.
Right.
And there's stuff that happens in between. Like maybe there's a bump, maybe there's a jostle, maybe then they tell people to brace themselves and enter like a like a braced position. Maybe the lights start flashing.
Right. So
maybe
psychologically,
the pressure
it's
doesn't
terrifying.
Yeah, like it's not
That's
like
suffering.
It's not that is pain and suffering. You know what I mean? Before you black out from going anywhere, because a plane doesn't just like go like wah. You know what I mean? Like I guess there are some examples where it hasn't actually. Some of those, like where it goes. But regardless, there's a whole world where people understand it before they're just like completely. But who knows? And maybe it's just the calm as Hindu cows Fight Club thing with the oxygen and stuff. I don't want to get in the way of that fantasy for you, right?
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's also like, think about what other brand has to contemplate a world in which their brand value is going to be held against that eventuality? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's a real challenge for a brand. A SaaS company doesn't have to contemplate whether or not when they say that we're collaborative, if their mainframe is going to blow up and suddenly kill
Yeah.
all of their customers. Like
Yeah.
so having to negotiate that is really interesting. You mentioned like the whole thing around driving our psychology in this, right? Like yes, it's more everyone says it's way more dangerous to get behind the wheel of a car. But if my car could suddenly fall 30,000 feet, I probably would be a little more hesitant to
Right.
get behind the wheel. It's sort
Yeah.
of like there's a there's a lot that these brands have to deal with that normal brands don't have to deal with. A lot of
And yeah, we're so like it's so difficult to physically perceive the difference between 25 miles an hour and 70 miles an hour in a
Yeah,
car
yeah.
when you're like, like you don't feel that much different.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great call.
yeah. I think about this too much, Topher. It's way too much.
I feel like we brought us too close to your like scary places, and so we can pull back.
Let's pull back out. Let's go back to the brand
We're gonna
house,
go
the keyhole,
brand
the heart.
house, brand basics. Exactly. So I was feeling kind of like by the time I got to the point about like the reading those court filings and stuff like that, I was feeling like no one at Boeing understands
Right.
brand. They don't understand it, and like for better or for worse, they ended up in a place where like brand actually like has a ton to do, not just with their public perception, but their internal operating. And I feel like even at that level, from a B2B branding perspective, they're
Right.
really doing a terrible, terrible job. But then
Bing.
I found
The
something.
light comes through the cloud.
Yes, and this I think is going to only serve as further condemnation of the fact that like
God
they
damn it.
know better and they're not doing better. But it is going to help to wrap up everything that we've been talking
Okay,
about
I
and
love it.
serve as a little bit of like a reminder for the things that we have covered in our basics of like fundamentals of brand.
Yeah.
Because I found a pamphlet that Boeing made as part of their Startup Boeing program, which is designed to support and foster fledgling airlines. Because you can see the business side of this. They're like, we need more customers. Like the more airlines there are, the more people will buy our stuff. And if they like Boeing, then they'll buy our planes. So we might as well like help.
Yeah.
And so I want to just read the quotes
Okay.
that I thought were interesting from this.
Right.
And these are going to be interesting. There's 4 quotes. They're going to be interesting for 2 reasons. One, they actually do a good job of encapsulating very clearly fundamental components of branding
Nice.
that everybody should know. And if you're new or sort of like need a refresher, these are helpful things to remember.
Okay.
2, you should think about these and think like, is Boeing doing these?
Okay. Sweet.
1, brand is what you say and do. It is the origins of your business. It is reinforced through the behavior of every employee and product and iterated in every business decision.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty concise and clear.
And also maybe something they could stand to think about.
Well,
2,
is it how they operate or how they act, Topher? See, that's where.
they said behavior. They gave themselves a loophole. Okay. 2, some say that you don't, quote, own your brand. The customer does.
Interesting.
It's the
Yeah.
impressions that your brand makes,
Totally.
genotype versus phenotype.
Yeah.
3, company purpose. This is more than making a profit. What significant difference do you want to make in the world? It addresses how the firm will change the world, make life better for someone, overcome a challenge, etc. And then 4, principles and beliefs. These help set the ethical and behavioral parameters of the business and become actualized in the business plan and the day-to-day operations of the firm.
Right. Okay. This is a pretty. We should gently borrow that for some conversations because I think it's a really clean structure.
I'll include the full pamphlet, a link to the full pamphlet in the show notes.
Nice.
It's pretty rigorous. It's like 4 pages.
Yeah.
They break down all this stuff. They have obviously, like, you can see that it's branding done through the mind of an engineer because the 12 steps are inextricably linked. They
Yeah.
are very linear. They each build on each other. And like, it's all kind of like, here's how you build a brand in
Right.
the same way you build a wing.
Have you ever worked on an engineer brand before? An engineer-focused brand?
I know you have some deeper experience in that than I do.
It's really fascinating for many reasons. One is that rigor that you're talking about, like the it's just embedded in the company, and there's like a at times healthy skepticism for some of the woo-woo that brand brings. And so you have to sharpen your game a little bit to present things to the engineering culture in ways that they understand it, in ways that feel like this is a useful thing because it delivers X. It's it leads to Y. And so it's really fascinating. There's also just sort of like a sense of recognizing another culture of problem solving. Brand, like what we do effectively is problem solving. It's creative problem solving, strategic problem solving. We look at what's happening, a company's challenges vis-a-vis their market, and we figure out how do we solve that problem using the tools that we have that are verbal, visual, strategic. And engineers are problem solving companies. And so seeing each other as like distant cousins, and trying to form a common language there is always really, really fun and fascinating.
That's cool. Well, this takes me to kind of thinking forward into our next episode.
Love it.
You're talking about engineering culture, and I want to live in an entirely opposite space for our next one. I want to take you away from the scary times.
Okay, no more plummeting.
No more plummeting. No more sort of like whistleblowers and war profiteering. 12 different types of collusion. We're not doing any of that.
None of that.
The brand that you'll be investigating for our next story is Crayola.
Ooh, every child's favorite meal. Wait, Crayola. That sounds amazing. Everyone has a connection to that. That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's fun. I already feel lighter, Topher. I can see the colors.
Break.
I can smell them. You know.
Yeah, 100%.
This is great. Wow. I actually don't know anything about Crayola. That's the thing.
Me neither.
It's one of those companies where I'm like, oh, it's been ubiquitous in my life, but I have zero idea if it has a history, how old it is. Did it just materialize in 1973 when I did? Or like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, well, that's next time. So join us to have a Technicolor ride through a waxy, fun, paper-wrapped cylinder of joy called Crayola.
Yes.
You've been listening to Strange Coordinates, the show where we use brands to arrive at surprising places. Your hosts are Topher Burns and me, Robert Balog. To learn more about our agency's Territorial, you should go to our website. It's weareterritorial.com. And join our mailing list. Follow us on LinkedIn. Follow us on YouTube. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We've been so happy to have you on this journey through the dark hallways of Boeing, and we hope that everyone at Boeing comes out the other side shining bright and clear.
Yeah.
Topher, maybe not so much. Topher's not offering as much goodwill, but I feel like maybe the distance will do that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm flying soon, so we'll see. I'm definitely going to be thinking about this while I'm staring at like the Boeing logo, like, yeah, we'll see. But anyway, thank you everybody for joining us.
We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye now. After this, can we do a segment on why, when I was a copywriter, my parents shouldn't have just let the commercials play but mute them? So the only part of the commercials that I actually had a direct role in, they didn't hear. Like, can we do a segment on that? Because that was always a tough one to explain to them. They're like, I'm just
Wait.
Yeah.
Is this a thought experiment?
They just mute commercial breaks, and and I was like, I write ads. So the part that I did, if one of my ads came up, you wouldn't hear it. So I was kind of standing up for copywriters everywhere, basically, was what I was trying to do.
Well, that's what social's here to do now. We put captions on everything, and we're restoring dignity to the humble copywriter.
That is an absolute oxymoronic statement right there. Humble copywriter. Yeah, humble copywriter.
Restoring well-deserved plaudits to the celebrated copywriter.
There you go. Perfect.